All right. So again, like I said, these are going to go really quick, and I'm doing it mainly because you should have read. So fiscal policy in a nutshell is basically government policy to spending. All right. It is not money in the sense that it's not coming from the banks. This is coming directly from the government. All right. So what is the role of fiscal policy? What is the federal budget? And how that policy has interacted through the history of our economic situation since basically the Depression. All right. In this, we're going to typically look at how it affects government's spending to the aggregate demand and how that affects supply and how that stabilizes things like recessions from being even worse than they are, or even, heaven forbid, booms from being too big before they burst. All right. So this policy involves government taxes and spending, both of them. It's going to come with an adjustment to our consumption function that we learned in chapter 9. All right. It's a lot easier to say it, though, than to understand it. So be careful. Spending and taxation is not something that's fun, but it can increase the deficit. It can be a controversial topic in regards to deficit spending and those deficit ceilings, as opposed to lowering them, or wait, we've gotten too big and we've spent too much and now we have to raise taxes, and how that is a political nightmare. All right. So how does it all work? All right. Government purchases are typically a part of demand, and so they increase the demand. If we increase government spending, it's a signal to the rest of the people to start spending themselves, and we call that an expansionary policy. All it does is breed confidence. It's just saying, hey, things are good. Go out and buy something. Celebrate the significance of how good our economy, how stable our economy is. Even if it's not, it is a signal to expand the economy through your spending, through private industry spending, or even further government spending and more exports. Okay? Opposite typically is a contractionary, saying, whoa, 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 whoa. Y'all, we need to control this inflation. It's getting way out of hand. Greedy people need to be less greedy. And guess what? I'm going to go raise taxes. Typically, when we raise taxes, we're saying, don't spend any more money. You don't have it to spend. You need to be saving that money. All right? And so it shifts the demand to the left. If we recall, though, there's multiplier effects. There's ripples to this. An initial change is going to have typically a larger eventual effect. Now, all this takes time in how fast it gets enacted, but the main purpose is to get it moving or stop it. And if we use a multiplier of 1.5 in our original from chapter 9 on our $10 billion in initial spending, which was good to boost the economy, we're actually increasing demand, though, by 15 billion. Multiply it. So policymakers need to understand that it's not just one little spending, it has ripples. All right, these are stabilization policies. There are limits to this. Policy actions take time to move the economy closer to full employment with a potential output. So implementing effective stabilization policies is difficult. Lags, delays, arguments in our stabilization policy. These inside and outside lags are results of political party fighting, most likely, or deciding how much is enough. With economic forecasts being uncertain, that can be a big thing. All right, so I'm going to walk you through 2009's financial crisis in a when did they notice it type situation. I'm going to give you a rough scenario And we're going to go back to our Jamboard like we do so that you can actually see something in action. Now, we've talked business cycles before. They look like waves, ups, peaks, and troughs, right? This is our peak. This is our trough. Peak, trough, all right? But let's put a timeline on it. Y'all have done timelines in history, right? So if I said that the recession of 2009 actually started happening well before 2009, how many of you would have believed that? There are some hidden factors that we didn't know were going on. We had a housing boom in the 2006. People wanted to own their own house. And where they go get loans. And the banks kind of go, wow, I'm making money off of that. Great. And so they decided to make even more off of it. That's a different topic that I'm going to talk about later. But it's important to understand, when did government start to recognize the problem, though? Was it in 2006 when we were booming? Was it in 2007 when the boom was still happening and we didn't see a dip? When did it start happening? Well, let's just put a timeline. We're going to go ahead and assume that it didn't start until 2007. All right? 2007, January, when, all that Christmas holiday celebrating ends and everybody's taking stock of what their sales were like. We're still booming, all right? But in February, typically we slow down. March, we might slow down in April. That's normal. As long as we go back up, right? But in 2007, we didn't really go back up. So this is the first quarter. January to March. All right. No red flags at this point. But then April and May and June happen. And so that's another quarter going by. Things were not necessarily going right back up. We started having issues. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the home loans and student loans institution was not doing so well. People were defaulting on loans that we thought were, hey, why is everybody defaulting on these loans? No big deal, just one or two companies. They can go bankrupt, no big deal. But that's not what the government wanted. So they made a decision. They bought into, gave money to Freddie Mae and or Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. All right. And we're going to delve more into this. I'm just going to go skippy to show you the inside and outside lags. All right. So that's another quarter. And so we're looking at April, May, June, and we're looking at July. All right. So then we got August, September, October, and October 1st is when budget must be voted on. We need to decide on what we're going to spend our government money on, or decide how much emergency funds we're going to need. Now, keep in mind, these quarterly reports, this is not a red flag here. This is the red flag where we start analyzing and we start going, maybe we need to watch this. All right. The story goes on, and October 1st happens, and nobody knows anything about it because it takes time to get that information to the people who need to know. And so November, December, and January happened in 2008. All right. The idea is that sometimes it takes years to get legislature to recognize there's a problem. Sometimes it takes months. But how soon do we recognize the problem is our inside lag. Typically, a recession starts to occur after 2 quarters. Okay? After 2 quarters, if we don't have an upward swing, we got a problem. We got to deal with it. But any time after however long it takes to the government to decide what action to take is considered an outside lag. Because it can take months, it can take years. And in 08, 07, we're sitting here, we haven't had a depression since, a real depression, since 29. We had a recession back in the 70s. We had a recession back in the 90s. Had a recession, but they resolved themselves rather quickly without too much government action. This one was not resolving. And so economists have gone back and said maybe it started well before 07. For us to have felt and taken a lot longer to respond from, because this lasted from 2007 through 2009, the election of a new president. If we had made a decision on October 1st to fix this problem, it should not have lasted through 08 and 09. Just saying. Inside lag, the time it takes to recognize there's a problem. Outside lag, time it takes to implement a solution and have it affect. All right, to actually work. All right, so stabilization policies like legislature decision making, they have to make decisions that are going to smooth out those peaks and troughs so that they're not so steep and they're not felt as hard. All right. We should be able to draw a line between and see a balance, a symmetrical top and bottom, smooth out. We'd rather have booms than have busts, though, okay? And we use that full employment line, the full employed natural employment line, as our guidance, okay? So when it skips below 3, we're okay with that. But when it gets above 6% unemployment, we have a problem. American people are fixing to go snowballing unemployed. All right. So these, again, show the GDP in absence of the policies, but the dotted line shows what can come down from. So the solid line is after those stabilization policies go into effect. If without that, they could rise to whatever it wants to or decline as far below as it needs to. Of course, we can't go below bust, but we can always have longer depression than we want. So again, this is important to understand. Inside lags occur for 2 basic reasons. It takes time to identify that problem, recognize that it's a problem, and then it takes politicians time to make those actions take place. Write the legislature, laws, pass it. Oh, wait, what if we don't have an agreeable majority? Well, outside lags increase the time for that policy to be effective. So stimulus projects, those things that the president can actually do, those emergency stimulus checks, as long as it's out of his emergency fund and it's just for an emergency and it fixes the problem, no big deal. But larger stimulus projects like we did for COVID-19 multiple times, those take months sometimes, and they can take years to actually be completed. FDR's New Deal took years for it to fix the problem. And if the government can cut taxes, it takes time for those households and firms to adjust their living style. How many of you would like to live on less than you have right now? Probably not many. So, forecasting uncertainties is not a fun job, and it's very difficult. Why? Because sometimes our information is not accurate. Sometimes it's an emergency blip that's due to, I don't know, other countries. Sometimes a slowdown could be temporary, or it might be permanent. How large will the ripple effect multiplier have for a particular policy. Will 600 be enough, or do we need to go to 2,400, 1,200? Or in TARP, $750 million to banks. Let that one sink in on you. Without accurate forecasting, stabilization policies are likely to be effective. They could also be disastrous. Most economic policymakers understand these limitations, and they are cautious to activate policy that can have ripple of negative impacts as well as positive ones. So, where did this fund, what's causing part of this? Well, part of it's increased health and life expectancies. They're living longer. So it's the cost of caring for those elderly people could be one. Caring for children could be another. No insurance. These are an application of what needs to go into place in regards to what do we do when their funds run out, like in the elderly and their Social Security, and we have no money. We've got a lot of people working, but that Social Security pot is shrinking by day. So I pose this question to my face-to-face students. I'm going to pose it to you. Do we kill all the old people so that you can have a Social Security? Because it's going to take your Social Security just to pay for my parents. You're not going to have Social Security as long as we stay on this same path. Is that something we want to do? Kill off our grandparents? Oh my God, that's like having a modest proposal for the Irish written by Charles Dickens. It's not very fun, and it's very sarcastic, yes, but it's not humane. Or how about this? We just let the children die and not have a new future age. There's so many complications. You do this, then this other person suffers. You do that, well, then these people suffer. There's no right answer. There's only assist, reassist, reevaluate, reassist. Nothing's going to be perfect because we don't want to be generous. All right? So then what goes into our budget? If that's the case, if we're trying to figure out, do we kill the old people, or do we keep Social Security, or do we have Medicaid programs, or do we have SNAP programs, do we have welfare programs, do we have a military, do we have education? All these programs go into a budget. And if we were to sit here and decipher everything, all it tells us is where our federal government is going to spend its money and how it plans on paying for it. All right? It's a very large and complex document. If you look at 2016, the federal spending was 20.9% of our GDP. That's roughly $3.9 trillion. That's 11,000, almost 12,000 per person. But income taxes, the federal reserves, or federal revenues that came from us to the government was only 17.8%. That means a little less than 3%, a little more than 3%, actually, of the GDP failed to cover what the government said we needed to spend. And that puts us in a deficit. All right, so if this is an example of where our problems are. So we've got outlays. These are things that we look at dollar-wise. Then we got percentage of the GDP. So just keep in mind our total dollars that we spend are broken down into discretionary spending, entitlement spending, and our interest. Now, interest is important because we borrow money from the World Bank. Keep that in mind. That's what keeps us afloat. All right. Discretionary spending, this is usually the presidential spending, goes to defense as well as non-defense things like FEMA. All right. Entitlement spending or mandatory spendings are those that are enacted by Congress through laws. Social Security is one of them. Medicare is one of them. Medicaid's one of them. Some of those SNAP programs are. Unemployment insurance is. These are things that were put into place by law we must pay for. We don't have to pay for defense. Is it in our national security to do so? Absolutely. But we don't have to pay for Hurricane Katrina that wiped out New Orleans, totally devastated an economy. Or how about every hurricane that hits Florida? We don't have to pay for those. But we're human people that actually have feelings, and we actually care that these things are reestablished. New Orleans is a tourist spot, as is Florida. We don't want to see them destroyed. Orlando has, I don't know, Walt Disney World. We want to go there one day and at its prime. All right. But discretionary, if we go back to the discretionary spending, the Congressional Budget Office, also known as CBO, okay, keep that in mind because we're going to use that. They're the ones that determine whether or not this budget's going to work or not. All right. They take a report and then they vote on it on October 1st. We then have these policies in place where we actually spend it. They don't go into effect until the next year. However, if they don't make a decision and they don't agree, we shut down the government on October 1st until it does have an agreed upon budget. So the Congressional Budget Office declares what's in discretionary and what's in the entitlement in amounts based on what the IRS says in April 15th that it's supposed to collect. Now, does everybody pay April 15th? No, they don't pay their taxes all in on April 15th. We've gotten refunds up until April 15th, but some people file extensions, and so therefore some of that's not received for years based on extensions on extensions. Regardless of whether they're paying interest on that, that's beside the fact. The receipt of that money is important because if we don't have the money, we don't have the functionality of our government. All right. Then we have discretionary spending. These are programs that Congress has authorized that they take place. They're saying yes, but there's no law binding them. So we have a military. We provide defense. We also have non-defense spending. These are also shaped by activist policy. So typically, NRA can interfere on that too, right? Or any other lobbyist, all right? But entitlement is very important. I mean, this is something we just can't. Some of these are mean tested, but they benefit because they provide a recipient with income. They allow them to function inside of our economy as well. So they're important. If they falter, well, that means those old people are going to die, or those young people are going to die. We need them in our economy because they have a decision-making process on what we do for our GDP. All right? So if we look at our fiscal year in 2016, we brought in $3,267 billion. These came from individual income taxes at $1,546 billion. Social insurance taxes. So if you look at your paycheck, you'll notice that FICA is broken down. Some of these insurances come out of your paycheck in addition to your income tax. So some of these social insurance, like workman's comp, your uninsured taxes. These are basically your FICA, whatever's on your paycheck. I don't have a paycheck to sit here and tell you exactly what it is, but the social insurances are those things that keep things going. All right, then we have corporate taxes, and they were only, get this, $300 billion. Estate, excise, and other taxes at also $306 billion. Some of that was removed in the last 4 years. We don't have estate taxes, so that's actually going to decrease it even more based on what we pay in income taxes. Now, these are relatively little on corporate taxes for the government today. So due to failing corporate profits or growth of effective tax avoidance strategies by individuals, they're smaller than what you and I would pay. Again, estate taxes, they're controversial. They have been removed. Opponents say they destroy family businesses like family farms. Rich people say that, oh, if I made it, my children should get it, but the government shouldn't. There's a lot of different arguments in getting rid of the estate tax. But excise taxes, those are taxes on goods like fuel and cigarettes, and luxury taxes, custom duties that are at the port. Usually other governments may pay them, or corporations do so that they can do external business with other countries. Oops. Now, all that given what drives the economy. Y'all have heard of Reaganomics, right? I'm fixing to debunk Reaganomics and why it does not work. We typically call Reaganomics supply-side economics. It's a school of thought that actually emphasizes the role that taxes play in the supply of output in the economy. Now, keep in mind taxes and avoidance of taxes, all right? So, economist Arthur Laffer argued in the late 1970s that decreases in the tax rate could increase total tax revenues at its optimum, all right? There are some people that pay taxes, and then there are some people who take advantage that think that, oh, well, if other people are paying taxes, you don't need mine. The Laffer curve is a relationship between tax rates and tax revenues that illustrates high taxes could lead to lower tax revenue if the economic activity is severely discouraged. So virtually they're stating that the tax revenue idea won't work for income taxes. That's what economists are saying, because everybody has to pay a little bit. But cutting taxes can still have an important incentive effect. For example, they encourage business investments that may improve long-run output. They encourage, keep that with a grain of salt, because what we've seen in the last 4 years disproves it. In the recent years, the federal government ran a budget deficit of $567 billion. This deficit spending was financed through the sale of government bonds to the public. Basically, these are IOUs that the government promises to pay money back with interest later, usually through the banking system, all right? Sometimes you might have heard victory bonds before. These are the same thing. But if we're returning to a budget surplus, the government could rebuy these government bonds if they wanted to. But we're in a deficit, so the government's needing money all the time to basically pay off its debt, because we can't balance that budget. There's only been 1 year that we've ever balanced and then the years that, a couple of years following that, had a surplus. That year was 1996. All right. The deficit typically is anything that is beyond the spending as compared to our revenue. So if we're basically spending more than we're bringing in. A surplus says we're bringing in a lot more than we need to spend. And people say that we should typically balance the budget every year. We won't. Now, to jump off, here's another role of the government. Suppose the government's budget is in balancing when a recession hits. Budgets automatically go to a deficit because we have transfer payments, unemployment benefits, SNAP, welfare programs, things that are not income to people, but they help them pay their bills off, make sure that they have their basic needs. Then we have income tax receipts are well below because of falling incomes, and corporate tax receipts are also going to fall because of falling profits. When we have a negative to everything, we should be running a deficit. The increase in transfer payments and decrease in taxes provide stimulus to the economy. When you decrease taxes, you're saying, please spend, please spend, please spend. We need you to spend more without a need to wait for politicians to take that action. These are automatic stabilizers. I increase the sales tax. I don't want you to buy. I decrease the sales tax. I'm saying, it's good for your health. Go ahead. But are deficits themselves running on a negative? Are they bad? Policies to stimulate the economy during a recession will turn into a deficit. Or are they going to make the existing deficit even worse? We look at this as COVID-19. We are already in a deficit. But if we didn't spend the stimulus checks, would we be worse off than where we were in 2019? That's something you need to think about. This may also be the right action to take, though it does not have an opportunity cost. We have to sometimes sacrifice our future revenue to paying back the debt. Sometimes keeping our economy going has a price. In the long run, the output is at a potential. An increased government sector crowds out that. By giving money out, we're crowding out anybody else helping it, fixing it. Adversely, when government stops spending, businesses then crowd in. The CBO, which I mentioned before, comes from a Congress Joint Committee on Taxation. They score the budget, estimating that a net effect on that budget, whether it's going to do its job or not. So in 2015, Congress changed the rules, allowing the committee to estimate the macro effects of policy changes, like growth rates. And we call this now a dynamic scoring. What typically, are we growing as a country or not? Dynamic scoring tends to favor cutting taxes. Everybody likes to cut taxes and increase spending, which model suggests that we will have an increased growth rates. Usually because the government is part of that GDP. But if we were to look at fiscal years, all right, so if I cut taxes, I'm going to debunk, this is the part where I'm debunking Reaganomics. And I say that our economy is driven by supply and supply only. And let me let you think about this. If I had a tree, and I produced a tree, multiple trees, same tree, and nobody wanted the tree, is it driving economics now? As opposed to if I have a money tree, oh wait, everybody wants money, right? More money trees is better, right? Demand is what's saying plant as many money trees as you possibly can, not supply. All right. Here's the other portion of Reaganomics. Reagan in the 1980s, Reagan cut taxes on corporate taxes in hopes that they would trickle down to the American people. Now, that's not actually what happened. Corporate saw the tax cut as a benefit to all those people who run the company. Now, most people would say, well, the little people run the company. No. They're stockholders. They're CEOs. They're vice presidents. Bonuses. It led to the rich spending the money and the poor getting poorer. That is not a trickle down of what was intended. What was intended was those taxes go down into wages. Now, wages did not increase in the 80s. I had my first job and I was making $3.35 an hour. The major raise that I got was $3.65 an hour. Not very big when you look at what we did this past year in what we were discussing of $7.40 going to $15 an hour. Very controversial subjects when you talk about trickle-down theories. Now, trickle-down economics or supply-side economics or Reaganomics, however you want to phrase it, is a theory. It's supposed to, it has good intentions. The reality is nowhere near that. And we saw that during 2009. We'll talk about that later. All right. So, historically, we had World War II, and that's what ended basically the Great Depression because we went back to work. Not only in the war effort, we also went back to work at home. We had people who came back from the war, and we had New Deal policies like the CCC camps, Workman WPA. We had lots of different policies in place for people to go back to work and feel confident about making money. All right? The Depression era, the basic principle was using government spending to stabilize the economy. It's been known for many years that it works. During the 1930s, politicians did not believe in modern fiscal policy, though, largely because they feared the consequences of big government moves, government budget deficits. These fears, though, only were in regards to the expansion from 1931 to 36. No net fiscal policy expanded at all during the 30s. All right, during Kennedy's administration, deficit spending on World War II had unintended effects, dragging the U.S. economy out of the Depression. But 1961, with the unemployment above full employment at 6.7, and a proposed tax cut to stimulate growth. At the time, tax rates were extremely high. They were at 52% for corporate taxes, and individual tax was 91% of your pay. How would you like to only have 9% of your paycheck? Kennedy advisors convinced him that deficits created would be eliminated by future growth. We would come out of this with rose-colored glasses on a shiny new car. Tax cuts were reenacted in 1964, though, and the economy did grow 4% per year for several years. In the Vietnam War era, during Vietnam, military spending was at its highest. Economy appeared to be overheating. 1968, temporary tax surcharge, an increase in taxes owed by 10% was enacted. We raised taxes. This had little effect, though, on consumer spending. We didn't really feel it because it didn't change to permanent income. The surtax reduced household savings, not its consumption. We liked to live the way we like to live. The Reagan tax cuts enacted in 1981 at the beginning of the first term, Ronald Reagan, were significant. The tax cuts were not proposed to increase demand. They were justified on the basis of improving economic incentives and increasing supply output. So they were supply side motivated. The 1980s, midnight large government budget deficits began to emerge, though. Policymakers became more concerned with deficit reduction than stabilization policy. Uniquely, though, George Bush and Bill Clinton, at the beginning of the administration, Clinton proposed a stimulus package that would increase aggregate demand, but it was defeated. So nothing happened at that point. Later, though, when they got together, Clinton and the Congress passed a major tax increase. Now, why would we increase taxes if we want to improve? Well, it was to balance the budget, and it brought the federal budget into an actual surplus. 2001, though, President George Bush pushed and passed a 10-year tax cut plan, part to stimulate the economy. Wait, keep in mind, Clinton just balanced the budget. We have a surplus. but the economy was stagnant. Wasn't growing. Wasn't declining either. Not much. But if you want to stimulate, yeah, you can cut and put money in people's pockets. Was it a good deal? Well, after 9/11, a fear stopped the economy. We were, at that point, were fearing a depression, so the tax cut actually boosted confidence. This was again expanded in 2003. Then we have Obama coming into office in 2007. This is a result of the housing crisis that happened, but it brought the start of the worst recession since the Great Depression. So like I said, that 2007 pretty much was before 2000. It was caused before 2007. 2008, though, President Bush and Congress responded with tax rebates. 2009, President Obama and Congress enacted the largest stimulus package in United States history, consisting of spending increases and tax cuts. Stimulus was controversial in both size and composition because it went to banks. By fiscal year 2011, the budget deficit was 8.7% of GDP, which was far above the historical levels. And then we have Trump. On the rise of our economy was rising, Trump enters in December 2017. He then does a major 25% budget cut or major tax cut to corporations. This was designed to stimulate growth, bring corporate taxes closer to international rates. Now, keep in mind, the last person to cut corporate taxes prior to this was Reagan. Unemployment was at 4.1%. We are fully employed at the time of the tax cuts, or near full employment, actually full employment. The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, predicted that the tax cut, combined with existing spending policies, would increase publicly held debt from 77.5% of the GDP to 97.5% in 2027. Now that is just 5 years away from now. We've had COVID. We've increased it even far beyond that and have added stimulus checks. Biden stimulus checks and Trump stimulus checks. Our deficit is well beyond the 97.5%. So this is an example of where expenditures in the red versus revenues in the blue. Notice where we had the surplus, where the blue was above the red, and where they hit right at breaking even. Notice that the yellow line, the deficit, at the same time as the budget surplus, we were at zero deficit. As does the correlating deficit increasing when the expenditures got above revenues. Difference is revenues and the deficit almost mirror each other. How effective was the 2009 stimulus, though? The American Recovery Reinvestment Act was the largest stimulus. Temporary tax cuts probably had little effect, which would be consistent with the theory on permanent versus temporary changes in the economy. Let that sink in. Tax cuts rarely fix everything. Moderation. Tax increases have a tendency when they match budget spending. Y'all have a good day. I will return with 11 and 12 tomorrow.